I want to show you what these verses in Ephesians chapter 4 are all about. In these verses, the Apostle Paul is contrasting the old self with the new self. That is to say this: if you're a Christian, God has a new way for you to live, and the reason for that is that He has made you into a new creation. Notice how Paul contrasts the old self here with the new self here. That's where I'm getting those words. And really, in this second half of Ephesians chapter 4, Paul is contrasting the old self, and we looked at that last time, and the 8 descriptions of how unbelievers live, with the new self. And really, this section goes all the way down through verse 32. Today, we're only going to get to verse 24. Paul describes the new self. Listen to what Paul says here in verse 20. He says this: "But that is not the way you learned Christ." Well, what's not the way you learned Christ? Well, he's referring back to the life of the old self. Those 8 descriptions we looked at last time of how the lost are thinking their whole mindset is wrong and they're following the lustful desires of their heart. Paul's saying that is not the way you learned Christ. What does it mean to learn Christ? I think that's just a way of describing someone who is converted. When someone learns Christ, that means they have come to know Christ. I think perhaps it's also talking a little bit more than just conversion. Perhaps it's talking also about the life that we are to live. As a Christian, you learn when you read Scripture that you are to live a certain kind of life, what it means to follow Christ. Paul's saying the way the Gentiles live, that's not how you learned Christ. Then he has kind of this side comment here. He says, assuming that you have heard about Him and were taught in Him. Now, I don't think that Paul is necessarily questioning this with the Ephesians. I don't think he's saying, boy, I don't know, maybe you have heard about Jesus, maybe you haven't. No, I don't think that's the idea, because Paul actually lived in Ephesus for a couple of years, and he was the one who was teaching them. And so I think he's saying, listen, you guys have heard something different. I know this. You have learned something different about how to follow Christ, what it means to follow Christ. It's not to live according to the old self, it's to live according to the new self. He's saying this: basically, you have been taught 3 things. 3 things. And that's what the next couple verses are all about. It's 3 words here. You took off, you are being renewed, and you put on. These 3 words all go back to this idea of being taught. Notice something important here, that what Paul is talking about has a lot to do with how people think. He talks about learning and being taught and being renewed in the spirit of your minds. And this really is different than the old self. The old self was thought in the futility of their mind. They're darkened in their understanding, and they were ignorant. And so Paul is saying, when you came to know Christ, you learned to think a different kind of way. And when you think differently, you behave differently. And so it all really boils down to this idea of what you were taught. That's what these verses are all about. Let's take a look at these each in turn. First here is this: you took off your former way of life, the old self. You might think of it like this. Paul says this, that you took off, and then you're being renewed, and then you put on. That's kind of the 3 things you were taught. Think of it like this. If you're spending the day doing yard work, and your clothes get all dirty, and you're dirty, what do? Well, you come inside, you take off the dirty clothes, you take a shower, you get renewed, and then you put on the new clothes. That's maybe not the image that Paul has in mind, but that's an easy way that I have of kind of understanding this text. First, you took off your former way of life, the old self. Notice that I'm using the HCSB version for these 3 verses because I think it translates this idea better. I don't think Paul is saying that you were taught that you need to take off your old self. I think he's saying, Christian, here's who you are. Christians are people who have taken off the old self. Listen to what Paul says in Romans chapter 6. He says this, knowing that your old man is crucified with him, that the body of sin might be destroyed. That's who a Christian is. A Christian is someone that the old man has died. It's been crucified with Christ. It's no longer there. And so Paul's saying, look, it's foolish to go back and live like the old man when he's already died. Baptism, I think, represents this. Think of what baptism is. It's saying like the old man died, and then you're put into the water, and that represents you're buried with Christ, and then you're raised with Christ to newness of life. And so the old self is gone. That old self, by the way, was corrupted by deceitful desires. You know, desires themselves can be sinful. It's not just acting on lust that's sinful, it's lusting itself. Deceitful desires, Paul talks about here. Paul's saying you took that off. That's what you were taught. Second thing you were taught is that you are being renewed in the spirit of your minds. God is present tense, ongoing. He's renewing the minds of Christians. Has this ever happened to you before that you were angry at someone else and it's kind of like you're grinding your teeth at them? They're wrong, you're right, and then you go to church, or you open the Bible, or you listen to something on the radio, and God speaks to you, and He shows you, according to His Word, that's the wrong way to be thinking. God has a way of correcting the way we think. He has a way of renewing our minds. Renewing means like to make young again. Think of it when you fix something and it's like it's as good as new. That's what God does to our minds. And Paul's saying, I taught you different than to live according to that old man. God is constantly renewing our minds. Third thing that they were taught, you put on the new self. That's what a Christian is. A Christian is someone who has put on the new self. They are a new creation. Look at this phrase. Specifically, this new self is the one that was created according to God's likeness. The Bible talks about how humans are made in the image of God. This verse here is interesting. You're created, Christian. The new creation of a Christian is created according to God's likeness. All humans are made in the image of God, but only Christians can be conformed into the image of Christ. Only Christians can be conformed to the image of Christ. And so, how is it that we're conformed into His image? Well, in righteousness and in purity of the truth. So Paul is trying to say this to the Ephesian Christians. He's saying, listen, don't live according to the old self. That's not what you learned. You were taught something different. You were taught about the new self. And he's just getting started into how Christians are to walk, what the new self looks like. We'll look into more of this next time. Thank you guys so much for joining us, and we will see you again next time.